The Battle of San Jacinto was a battle fought on April 21st, 1836. With news of the defeats in South Texas, pressure began to mount on Sam Houston to attack the Mexican army. The Texian troops were angry about what had happened at the Alamo and Goliad and demanded action. But Sam Houston was afraid that the Texian army was undermanned and undertrained, so he began to move the main force of the Texian army away from Santa Anna. They began to move eastward to the Brazos River, with Santa Anna's army not too far behind. Complaints within the camp became so strong that Sam Houston posted notices that anyone attempting to usurp his position would be court-martialed and shot. By March 28th, the Texian army had retreated 120 miles across the Navidad and Colorado rivers. On March 31st, Houston stopped his men at Grace's Landing on the Brazos River. 2 companies that refused to retreat further were assigned to guard the crossing. For the next 2 weeks, the Texians rested, recovered from illness, and for the first time began practicing military drills. While there, 2 cannons, known as the Twin Sisters, arrived from Cincinnati, Ohio. Interim Secretary of War Thomas Rusk joined the camp with orders from President David G. Burnett to replace Houston if he refused to fight. Houston quickly persuaded Rusk that his plans would work. Secretary of State Samuel P. Carson advised Houston to continue retreating to the Sabine River, where more volunteers were likely to flock from the United States. Unhappy with all of this, Burnett wrote to Houston, "The enemy are laughing at you to scorn. You must fight them. You must retreat no further. The country expects you to fight. The salvation of the country depends on your doing so." At this point, Santa Anna believed that the rebellion was in its final days. The Texian government had been forced off the mainland with no way to communicate with its army. He was determined to block the Texian army's retreat and put a decisive end to the war. On April 17th, to the gratification of his men, Houston took the road to Harrisburg instead of the road to Louisiana, and on April 18th, they would reach White Oak Bayou. There, he learned that Santa Anna had gone down the west side of the bayou and the San Jacinto River, crossing by a bridge over Vinches Bayou. Viewing the strategic situation, on the morning of April 19th, Houston told his troops that they would soon get action and told them in a speech to remember the massacres at the Alamo and at Goliad. That evening, his forces crossed Buffalo Bayou to the west side, 2.5 miles below Harrisburg. Some 248 men, who were mostly sick and ineffective, were left with the baggage at the camp on the other side of Harrisburg. At dawn on April 20th, the Texians resumed their trek down the bayou and captured a boat laden with supplies for Santa Anna. They then drew back about a mile on the Harrisburg Road and encamped in a skirt of timber, and Santa Anna's army would arrive a few hours later. The 2 camps of the Texian and Mexican armies were approximately 500 yards apart, separated by a grassy area with a slight rise in the middle. Colonel Pedro Delgado later wrote that the camping ground of His Excellency's selection is, in all respects, against military rules. Any youngster would have done better. Throughout the night, Mexican troops worked to fortify their camp, creating breastworks out of everything they could find, including saddles and brush. At 9 a.m. on April 21st, General Martin Perfecto de Cos arrived with 540 reinforcements, bringing the Mexican force to approximately 12 to 1,500 men, which outnumbered the Texian force of approximately 800 men. However, Cos's men were mostly raw recruits. They had marched steadily for more than 24 hours, with no rest and no food. As the morning wore on, with no Texian attack, Mexican forces lowered their guard. By the afternoon, Santa Anna gave permission for Cos's men to rest. His own tired troops also took advantage of this time to rest, eat, and bathe. Not long after Cos arrived with reinforcements, General Houston ordered Erastus Steph Smith to destroy Vinches Bridge to block the only road out of the Brazos and thereby preventing any possible escape by Santa Anna. Over the next several hours, 2 brief skirmishes occurred. Using the twin sisters, the Texians won the first engagement, forcing a small group of dragoons and the Mexican artillery to withdraw. In the second engagement, the Mexican dragoons forced the Texian cavalry to withdraw. Disobeying Houston's orders, many of the infantry rushed onto the field. In the melee, Thomas Rusk was almost captured by Mexican soldiers, but was rescued by newly arrived Texian volunteer Mirbu B. Lamar. As the Texian cavalry fell back, Lamar remained behind to rescue another Texian who had been thrown from his horse. Mexican officers reportedly applauded his bravery. Houston was furious that the infantry had disobeyed his orders and had given Santa Anna a better estimate of their strength. The men were equally upset that Houston had not allowed a full assault. Shortly before noon, Houston called his officers in a council of war to determine what they should do next. Two of the officers suggested attacking the enemy, while others favored waiting for Santa Anna to attack. Houston decided that they would attack the Mexican position at 3:30 in the afternoon while all was quiet on the Mexican side. The Texians began to move into position under the cover of the trees and the rising ground. The twin sisters would fire at the Mexican position at 4:30, formally beginning the Battle of San Jacinto. After a single volley was fired at the Mexican position, the Texians broke ranks and swarmed over the Mexican breastworks, yelling, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad," and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. The Mexican army was taken completely by surprise by the sudden Texian attack. Santa Anna attempted to organize his men for a counterattack, but after 18 minutes of fighting, the Mexican soldiers abandoned their campsite and began to surrender. But the anger of the Texians could not be subdued, not even by Houston himself. The Texian soldiers continued firing on the Mexicans, even killing unarmed Mexican soldiers. According to Houston's official report, the casualties were 630 Mexicans killed and 730 taken prisoner, with minimal casualties on the Texian side. Houston was among those injured whose ankle had been shattered by a musket ball during the battle. Santa Anna had disappeared during the fighting, but was found the next day on April 22nd, hiding in the woods. However, the search party did not recognize him until he was addressed as El Presidente by other Mexican prisoners. Many Texians wanted to kill Santa Anna on the spot, but Houston refused to have him killed. He would explain after the war, "My motive in sparing the life of Santa Anna was to relieve the country of further bloodshed and to secure his acknowledgement of our independence." The treaties of Velasco were signed, and as a result, all Mexican forces withdrew south of the Rio Grande, and after 2 bloody years of fighting and 1,700 people dead, the Texas Revolution was finally over.